When I found the sold sign in front of my childhood home, I thought it was a mistake, the kind of cruel prank a stranger might pull. But then I saw my mother-in-law standing in the driveway, smiling politely at the real estate agent, and something inside me just stopped. I didn't scream. I didn't run to her. I just stood there, watching the woman I had spent weeks planning a surprise party for shake hands over the only piece of my past I had left. Until that moment, I'd thought my life was finally settling down. My name is Lydia. I'm 34, married to Daniel, and for the past year, I'd been living what I thought was a quiet, normal kind of happiness. We had our little home in the suburbs, our routines, morning coffee together, grocery runs on Saturdays, Sunday dinners with his mother, Margaret. Margaret was one of those women who seemed to have everything under control. Perfect hair, perfectly polite words, perfectly measured smiles. I used to think she was intimidating, but she treated me with enough kindness to make me feel accepted, or maybe tolerated. Daniel always said, "Mom just has strong opinions," and I'd always laughed, brushing off the small things, like when she'd fix my table settings or rewash the dishes I'd already cleaned. Those weren't crimes, just habits. And family, I told myself, was about patience, about choosing peace over pride. My childhood home, on the other hand, was my peace. A little weathered yellow house just outside the city, the one my parents built brick by brick. It was where I learned to ride a bike, where I buried my first pet under the oak tree, where my father taught me how to sand old furniture instead of buying new. He used to say, "Home isn't what it costs, Lydia. It's what it holds." After my parents passed, the house sat empty for a while. I couldn't bring myself to sell it. It wasn't fancy or valuable, but it held them. Every scratch on the doorframe, every creak in the floorboard. It was them. When Daniel and I got married, he suggested we rent it out until we decided what to do. I agreed. It felt like the adult thing to do. And because we were busy moving into his family's neighborhood, Margaret's neighborhood, I handed over the property paperwork to Daniel to manage for convenience. That small act of trust would later become the biggest regret of my life. 2 weeks before it all fell apart, I had this idea. Margaret's 65th birthday was coming up, and Daniel mentioned she'd never had a proper surprise party. She'd always been the planner, never the guest of honor. I thought, why not change that? I went all in. I made lists, bought decorations, reached out to her old friends, even booked a small event hall. I spent hours on Pinterest boards, picking gold and cream themes because she loved elegance. I wanted to impress her. Maybe. To prove that I could be the kind of daughter-in-law she'd be proud to have. I told Daniel, "I just want her to see how much I care." He smiled, kissed my forehead, and said, "She'll love you for this." The first sign that something was off came when I called my property manager to ask about renewing the lease on my childhood home. He hesitated, the kind of pause that carries too much. "Mrs. Collins," he said softly. "The sale went through last week." "The what?" I remember gripping my phone so tight my knuckles went white. He explained that the buyer was a woman named Margaret Collins. At first I laughed. "That's my mother-in-law. You must have it wrong." But he didn't. He emailed me the documents, and there it was. My home, my parents' home, sold for half its market value, signed off by my husband, Daniel Collins, with my name nowhere in sight. I called Daniel immediately. He didn't answer. I called again and again. Finally, he texted, "In a meeting." "What's wrong? What's wrong?" I typed back. "Did your mother buy my parents' house?" 3 dots appeared, then vanished, then appeared again. Finally, "We can talk when I get home." That night, when he walked in, I could already see the guilt written all over his face. His tie loosened, his eyes darting. He wouldn't meet my gaze. "Please tell me this isn't true." I said quietly. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's not what you think. Then what is it? I asked, voice trembling. He explained it like a businessman, not a husband. Apparently, Margaret had helped us by buying the house under her name because, according to him, it was too much work to maintain, and we were losing money on the rental. She invested in it so we wouldn't have to worry. It's still in the family, he said, like that was supposed to make it better. I just stared at him. You sold my childhood home without asking me. He shook his head. No, Lydia. I signed on behalf of us. It's joint property, technically. We didn't lose it. I repeated. Daniel, my parents built that house. You've never even painted a wall in it. His jaw tightened. You're overreacting. It's not like she's moving in. And then, the cruelest irony, he added. Besides, you're planning her birthday party. Maybe wait until that's done before we stir up drama. That night, I couldn't sleep. I just sat on the edge of our bed, staring at my phone, scrolling through old photos of the house, the garden, the kitchen window, my father's hands fixing that same creaky door hinge. And all I could think was how I'd been planning to hang a banner that said, Happy Birthday, Margaret. Meanwhile, she'd been signing away my past behind my back. I wanted to scream, to tear down every decoration I'd bought. But I didn't. I decided I'd go through with the party. Not for her, not for Daniel, but because sometimes silence speaks louder than rage. I needed to know why. Why she wanted that house. Why Daniel agreed. Why no one thought I deserved to be told. And deep down, I knew that the party, the one I'd built for her, would be the perfect stage for the truth to show itself. The week before the party, I moved through my days like a ghost. I smiled when I had to, spoke when someone spoke to me, and nodded at Daniel's explanations that sounded more like excuses. But inside, everything was hollow. Every time I looked at Margaret, I saw the woman who had smiled her way through taking something that wasn't hers, something sacred. Still, I kept my word. I finished the plans. I ordered her favorite cake, lemon with vanilla frosting. I called her old bridge friends and told them, it'll be a surprise. They laughed and said, oh, she'll love you forever after this. If only they knew. A few nights before the party, I stopped by her house to drop off a set of printed invitations I'd accidentally left in my car. She opened the door wearing that usual calm expression, like she was in control of every conversation before it even started. Lydia, you're up late. Everything all right? Her voice was honey-coated. It always was. Just dropping these off, I said, holding up the envelope. She smiled, motioning for me to come in. You work too hard, dear. That husband of mine used to say a good daughter-in-law is the heart of the family. I sat in her living room, the scent of lavender candles and furniture polished thick in the air. Her home always looked like a magazine, every cushion fluffed, every picture frame gleaming. She poured us both tea, the kind that tasted like flowers instead of comfort. We talked, or rather, she did, about the party, the weather, her neighbors. I barely heard her. Then she said it, casually. I hope you don't mind, dear. I went ahead and handled the paperwork for that little yellow house of yours. It was just sitting there collecting dust. I froze. You handled it, I repeated, keeping my tone even. She sipped her tea, eyes steady on me. You're young, busy. That place needed someone to take care of it. Daniel agreed it was better for everyone if I just took it off your hands. I set my cup down carefully. You didn't take it off my hands, Margaret. You bought it, without asking me. Oh, Lydia, she said, with a soft chuckle that could have cut glass. You make it sound so harsh. It's all family, isn't it? And frankly, dear, it was wasting away. Your parents would want it loved, don't you think? That was the moment something cracked inside me. The way she said, your parents, like they were hers to interpret. I wanted to tell her how that home wasn't just walls and paint. It was Sunday breakfasts, late-night laughter, the sound of my father humming old songs while fixing the porch light, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I stood up. "You're right, Margaret. My parents would want it loved." She smiled, triumphant, and that's when I added softly, "But they'd never forgive the person who stole it." Her face stiffened, just for a second, but it was enough. That night, I didn't tell Daniel about the visit. He'd chosen his side already. Instead, I sat in bed and made a new list. I wasn't canceling the party. I was changing it. It wouldn't just be a celebration. It would be the moment everything came to light. If Margaret loved having control, I would take it away. In front of everyone. No shouting. No scene. Just truth. The day of the party arrived bright and warm. The kind of day you'd call perfect if you didn't know better. The event hall shimmered with gold and cream decorations. Candles lined the tables, and a banner stretched across the entrance. "Happy 65th, Margaret, the woman who holds us together." I stared at that line longer than I should have. The woman who holds us together. It felt like a cruel joke now. Guests began to arrive. Old friends, church members, cousins. The air filled with cheerful chatter, camera flashes, and the clinking of glasses. Daniel was busy greeting everyone, his face carefully cheerful, and then Margaret walked in, wearing a pale blue dress and a smile that could have been painted on. Everyone shouted, "Surprise!" She covered her mouth with her hand, gasping, the picture of joy. "Oh, Lydia! Oh, Daniel! You shouldn't have." For a moment, I almost believed it. Almost. We moved through dinner, the toasts, the laughter. I watched her float from table to table, complimenting everything. The flowers, the food, even me. When it was time for speeches, Daniel gave his first. He talked about what a pillar his mother had been, how she'd kept the family strong. People clapped, teary-eyed. Then he turned to me. "And none of this would have been possible without my amazing wife, Lydia." He gestured for me to come forward. I took a deep breath. My palms were sweating, my heart racing, but my voice was calm. "Thank you, everyone. Tonight's about family, about what we build together, and what we take from each other." The room quieted slightly. A few heads turned. I smiled, looking straight at Margaret. "Most of you know I grew up in a little yellow house on Rosewood Street. My parents built it with their hands. It's where I learned what love looked like." A few nods, murmurs of nostalgia. "What you don't know," I continued, "is that house was sold last week. Not by me, but by the woman I was planning this party for." The silence was immediate. Margaret's face didn't move at first, but the color drained slowly. She told me she wanted to take care of it, and maybe she did, just like she takes care of everything she wants. Someone dropped a fork. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Daniel stood up. "Lydia, no," I said quietly, not taking my eyes off his mother. "You said not to cause drama until the party was over." "Well, Margaret, the party's over." I turned, nodded to the event staff, and walked off the stage. Behind me, whispers spread like wildfire, soft, sharp, merciless. And for the first time since all of it began, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Peace. But peace doesn't last long in families like ours. Because that night, when we got home, Daniel's calm facade finally cracked. He slammed the door, pacing. "What the hell was that? You embarrassed my mother in front of everyone." "She embarrassed herself," I said quietly. "She was trying to help you, Lydia, by taking what wasn't hers." "She's my mother," he shouted, "and I'm your wife." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut through the air. He stared at me like he didn't recognize me, and maybe he didn't, maybe I didn't either. I turned away from him, walked into the guest room, and closed the door. That night, I slept alone, for the first time since our wedding, and strangely, it felt right. The morning after the party felt eerily quiet. No birds, no cars, no sounds except the ticking of the kitchen clock echoing through the house. Daniel didn't speak to me. He brewed his coffee, stared out the window, and left for work without a word. When the door closed, I exhaled, a long, shaking breath that felt like I'd been holding it for years. My phone buzzed endlessly. Messages, missed calls, gossip. Lydia, what happened last night? Did Margaret really sell your house? Are you okay? I ignored them all, because I wasn't okay. But I wasn't broken either. I was awake. That afternoon, I drove to Rosewood Street. I parked across from my old home, or what used to be mine. There was a sold sign still sticking out of the ground, bright red and merciless. The curtains had been changed. The porch swing, the one my dad built with his own hands, was gone. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, tears blurring my vision. That house had held every version of me, the little girl with scraped knees, the teenager who painted her walls sky blue, the woman who'd whispered promises to her parents' framed photo before moving out. And now, it was just another property on someone's balance sheet. I thought I'd cry forever that day, but after a while, the tears stopped, replaced by something colder, resolve. That evening, Margaret called. I let it ring twice before answering. "Lydia, dear," she began softly, like nothing had happened. "I think it's time we talked calmly. You've caused quite a stir." I laughed. I couldn't help it. "I caused a stir?" She sighed, exasperated. "You could have handled this privately. Families don't air their dirty laundry." "You're right," I said. "Families don't, but thieves do." "Watch your tone, young lady," she snapped, her mask finally slipping. "That house was falling apart. I was doing you a favor." "No, Margaret," I said quietly. "You were doing what you always do, taking things that make you feel powerful. But you took the wrong thing this time." There was a pause. Then her voice went sharp and cold. "You should be grateful I'm part of this family. Without me, Daniel wouldn't even." I hung up. For once, I didn't owe her a conversation. That night, Daniel came home late. His eyes were tired, his shoulders heavy. He stood in the doorway, silent for a long time before finally speaking. "Mom's furious," he said. "I'm sure she is. She says you twisted everything." I looked at him. "Do you think I did?" He didn't answer. He just rubbed his forehead and sank into a chair. "I don't know, Lydia," he muttered. "You blindsided her. You blindsided me." I laughed bitterly. "She blindsided me first." Silence again. Then quieter. "You could have told me you were planning that speech, and you could have told me you agreed to sell my house." His head lifted. "It was a mistake, okay? I didn't know didn't know, or didn't care." He flinched like I'd slapped him, and maybe my words did. I stood up. "I can forgive a mistake, Daniel, but not betrayal." He looked at me with pleading eyes. "I'm sorry." For a second, I almost softened. Almost. But then I remembered the papers. The laughter at that party. The way his mother smirked when she said your parents would want it loved. "No," I said finally. "You're sorry because you got caught." 2 days later, I packed a suitcase. Just a few clothes, my laptop, and a framed photo of my parents, the one from the porch. I left the house key on the counter. Daniel followed me to the door. His voice was barely a whisper. "Are you really leaving?" "I have to," I said. "I need to remember who I am without your mother's shadow hanging over me." He swallowed hard. "Will you come back?" I met his eyes, the same eyes that once felt like home. "Maybe when you stop letting someone else make your choices." Then I walked out. I stayed at a small rental on the edge of town, nothing fancy. just quiet. For the first time in years, silence didn't scare me. I started painting again, cooking for one, sleeping through the night without the constant ache in my chest. Days turned into weeks. Daniel texted a few times, polite, uncertain messages. I replied when I felt like it. But one morning, something unexpected happened. A letter came in the mail. The return address said Rosewood Street. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. Dear Ems Carter, we recently bought your family's old home. The previous owner mentioned you had deep sentimental ties to the property. If you'd ever like to visit, or even buy it back someday, please know our door is open. With respect, the Thompsons. I pressed the letter to my chest and cried. But this time, it wasn't grief. It was gratitude. That house was gone, yes. But maybe its spirit wasn't. Maybe love leaves echoes stronger than loss. Months passed. Daniel eventually came to see me. He looked different. Older. Quieter. He said he'd finally confronted his mother. That he'd realized how much control she had over every part of his life. He apologized, not with excuses, but with understanding. I didn't forgive him right away. Some wounds need time to close properly, but we started talking. Slowly. Honestly. No lies, no walls. A year later, I drove past Rosewood Street again. The house had a new coat of paint, pale yellow, brighter than before. A child's laughter rang from the porch, where a new swing hung gently in the breeze. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt peace. Because maybe that's what healing really is, realizing that losing something doesn't mean it stops existing. Sometimes, it just lives in a different form, in memories, in lessons, in the strength you find after everything burns down. I parked for a moment, smiled at the new family, and whispered softly, "Take care of her." Then I drove away, not toward revenge, not toward bitterness, but toward freedom, because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't anyone's daughter-in-law. I wasn't a victim. I was simply me. When I opened that old wooden box in my father's closet, I wasn't looking for ghosts. I was just looking for peace. But instead, I found a photograph, a little girl with my father's eyes, standing beside a woman I'd never seen before. The handwriting on the back was his, careful and familiar. "For my little Grace, Daddy loves you." In that moment, I swear, the air left my body. It was as if forgiveness, the kind I'd fought years to find, crumbled right in my hands. My name is Clara Mitchell. I'm 52 years old, and I've spent most of my life trying to understand a man I never really knew. Growing up, my father wasn't cruel in the way that leaves bruises, but in the way that leaves silence. He was a stern man, the kind who spoke in commands, not conversations. "Turn the lights off. Don't waste food. Your mother's resting." My mother used to hum in the kitchen when she cooked, trying to fill the air he left hollow. She died young, 43, a quiet woman who carried her peace like a secret. After she passed, our home became a museum of her absence. My father barely spoke for weeks after the funeral, and when he finally did, it was to tell me, "You'll need to grow up now, Clara. I can't do this alone." I was 16, so I grew up. I cooked, cleaned, balanced bills, and learned how to read the weather in his mood. If his shoulders were tight, it meant I should stay quiet. If his tone softened, I'd take the chance to ask him about school or friends. But most nights, we just sat in silence, him with his whiskey, me with my homework. I used to think he didn't love me, but as I got older, I realized he did, just in a way that hurt to accept. His love was conditional, heavy with pride and control. Years passed. I moved out at 20, got a job as a social worker, and told myself I wouldn't turn into him. I married young, divorced quietly, and poured all my care into the children I worked with instead. Still, no matter how far I went, he was there, in the way I over-explained myself, in the way I apologized too quickly. I carried his voice in my head like an unwanted echo. We didn't speak much for nearly a decade. Then, when he turned 75, I got a call from a neighbor. "Your father's been having dizzy spells," she said. "He won't see a doctor. Maybe you can talk to him." Part of me wanted to hang up. Another part, the little girl who still craved his approval, couldn't. So I went back. His house hadn't changed. Same ticking clock on the wall, same smell of dust and old leather. He was sitting in his recliner, thinner than I remembered, with that same stubborn tilt of his jaw. He looked up and said, "Well, you finally decided to visit." I laughed softly. "Someone told me you've been giving the paramedics attitude." He snorted. "They don't know what they're doing." I noticed his hands trembling as he reached for his glass. "Dad," I said, "you need to see a doctor." He grumbled something, but didn't argue. And that was our first real moment of peace in years. Over the next few months, I visited more often. We fell into a rhythm. I'd bring groceries, cook dinner, sit with him on the porch while he talked about his army days. He'd never been one for apologies, but one evening, he said quietly, "I wasn't easy to live with, was I?" I smiled, blinking away the sudden warmth in my eyes. "No," I said, "but neither was I." That was how I thought healing looked. Quiet dinners, unspoken forgiveness, a slow softening around the edges of old wounds. When he passed away 2 years later, I felt calm, not broken, not angry, just calm. I thought that meant I'd finally made peace. After the funeral, I stayed in his house for a week to sort through his things. I took my time. I wanted to do it with respect, the way he never did with my mother's belongings. Each drawer felt like a small excavation of history. Yellowed letters, faded shirts, the faint scent of his aftershave. I almost didn't open the wooden box in his closet. It was tucked under a pile of blankets, sealed with an old brass latch. Inside were letters, all addressed to someone named Margaret. And that photograph, a girl about 10 years old, her hair in braids, smiling beside my father. Grace. The letters were dated from the years after my mother died. At first, I thought maybe he'd been helping a family friend, but as I read, that illusion shattered. Margaret. I wish I could be there for her birthday, but Clara would ask questions. She's smart, too smart. I'll send the money next week. Don't tell her mother. She looks just like me, doesn't she? By the third letter, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. My father hadn't just been a distant man. He'd been a secret one. I sat on the floor for what felt like hours, surrounded by his lies. The house was silent, except for the old clock ticking down the hall. The same clock that had counted through all my lonely dinners as a girl. I remember whispering, "How could you?" Even though there was no one to answer. He'd hidden an entire child from me, a sister I never knew existed. And the worst part? He'd done it during the years I was begging for his attention. When he was telling me to grow up, he was building a second life somewhere else. I pressed my hand to the photo. Grace's smile was open, innocent, the kind of smile I used to practice in the mirror, hoping one day he'd look at me the way he looked at her. For the first time since his death, I felt something ugly rise in me, rage. Not the loud kind, but the quiet, bone-deep kind that makes you question everything you've ever believed about love and forgiveness. That night, I didn't sleep. I made tea, sat by his old window, and read every letter. By morning, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't rest until I found Grace. I needed to look her in the eyes, to see the truth my father had hidden all these years. Even if it broke the little forgiveness I had left, I didn't even know where to start. The letters gave me fragments, an address here, a phone number scribbled in the margin, a name that changed over time. Grace Martin, Grace M. My little Gracie. The last one was dated almost 15 years ago. 15 years. Had she ever known about me? Did she even know he had another daughter? One who grew up just a few miles away, waiting for a father who was too busy pretending he didn't have two lives? I spent days searching through old records, my social worker instincts kicking in. I knew how to track people, how to follow trails when they wanted to disappear. It took about a week before I found something, a school record from the early 2000s, then a public notice, a change of address, and finally, a Facebook profile. The moment I saw her picture, I stopped breathing. She looked so much like him, the same narrow eyes, that stubborn jawline, but there was something softer too, something that reminded me of my mother. I scrolled through her photos. There she was, holding a baby, another with a man, her husband maybe. Then one that made my stomach twist, a birthday post. Happy 35th to the best dad in the world. I miss you every day. My father. He'd been there for her birthdays. He'd been the kind of father to her that I used to dream about. And suddenly, every small act of affection he denied me made sense. It wasn't that he didn't have love to give. It was that he was giving it somewhere else. For 3 nights, I couldn't bring myself to reach out. What would I even say? Hi, I'm your secret sister. Our father lied to us both. Part of me thought I should just leave it. Let the past stay buried with him. But another part, the one that had spent her childhood searching his face for affection, couldn't rest. So I sent her a message. Hi Grace, my name is Clara. I believe we might be related. I know this might sound strange, but I'd really like to talk if you're open to it. I stared at the screen for 10 minutes before hitting send. Then I waited. 2 days passed. Nothing. On the 3rd day, I was folding laundry when my phone buzzed. Hi Clara. Related how? My heart pounded as I typed. I think we might share the same father, Robert Mitchell. The typing dots appeared and disappeared. Then again. Then stopped. Minutes later, a new message arrived. You must be mistaken. My dad passed away 3 years ago. He only had one daughter, me. I swallowed hard. The kind of lump that forms when your truth sounds like an accusation. I know this is difficult to hear. I didn't know about you either. I found letters in his house after he passed. I have photos too. There was no reply after that. Just silence. The next day, she called. Her voice was cautious but calm. You said you have proof? Yes, I said softly. I can send them to you or we can meet. She hesitated. Then, meet me at Cafe Haven. Saturday, noon. When Saturday came, I almost didn't go. I'd spent the morning pacing my kitchen, wondering if I was about to ruin a woman's image of her father, or finally make sense of my own. But I went. Cafe Haven was small, tucked on a quiet street, the kind of place where secrets might whisper across tables. She was already there, sitting by the window. The resemblance was instant. Not just in her face, but in her posture, that guarded calmness we must have both inherited. Grace? I said. She looked up, studying me for a long moment. You really do look like him, she said. And a little like me. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. I suppose we have him to thank for that. We sat in silence before she finally spoke. Show me. I pulled out the photograph and the letters, carefully arranged in a folder. She looked at them one by one, her face shifting from confusion to disbelief, then to something that broke my heart, grief. I don't understand, she whispered. He never mentioned you. Not once. I could say the same, I said quietly. He told me nothing. My mother died when I was 16. He made me believe he was just lonely. She looked at me, her eyes glistening. He wasn't lonely. He was. With us. That word, us, sliced through me. It wasn't her fault. She hadn't asked for this any more than I had. But hearing it said aloud, knowing that my father had built a home with her and her mother while I spent my youth begging for scraps of his attention, it broke something inside me all over again. We talked for hours. About our childhoods, our versions of him, the contradictions. To her, he was gentle, playful, the kind of dad who made pancakes on Sundays and showed up at school plays. To me, he was a shadow, present, but unreachable. At one point, she said, "I feel like my entire life was a lie." I nodded slowly. "Welcome to mine." Then I said something I hadn't planned. "You were lucky, Grace. You got the version of him I always wanted." Tears filled her eyes. "Maybe, but now it just feels stolen." When I got home that evening, I sat in my car for a long time before going inside. My father's ghost seemed to fill every space, not haunting me exactly, but demanding to be understood. I thought about Grace, how kind she'd been despite her own shock. She'd hugged me before leaving, whispering, "I'm sorry for what he did to you." And for the first time, I realized she wasn't my enemy. She was just another piece of the same wound. But forgiveness? That was harder. I'd thought I'd forgiven him before he died, for being distant, cold, controlling. But this was something deeper. He hadn't just failed me as a father. He'd replaced me, and somehow, even in death, he'd managed to hurt both of his daughters. That night, I took the letters back out and laid them on my dining table. One by one, I burned them, watching the paper curl and darken. The ink turned to ash. It wasn't anger. It was release. I kept only the photograph, not for him, but for her, because maybe someday, Grace would want to remember him, and I wanted her to have the choice that neither of us ever got. But forgiveness? That would take more than ashes. It would take truth, and I wasn't done uncovering that yet, because one of the letters, the last one, hinted that there was someone else who knew about Grace, someone still alive, and I needed to find them. It was almost midnight when I noticed it, a single line, buried near the bottom of that last letter, written in his neat, precise script. "Margaret helped me when I couldn't face the truth." Margaret. At first, I thought maybe it was Grace's mother, but Grace had said her mother's name was Diana. So who was Margaret? I sat at my kitchen table long after the clock struck 1, tracing my finger over that name. It wasn't just a note. It was a breadcrumb. My father hadn't been a man who asked for help easily. If someone had helped him face the truth, that person knew everything. And maybe, just maybe, they could tell me why. The next morning, I pulled out the old address book I'd taken from his desk when I cleaned out his things. Page after page of careful handwriting, clients, neighbors, old friends. I flipped until I found it. Margaret Ellis. I almost laughed at the irony. Ellis, my mother's maiden name. Life really did enjoy symmetry. The address was local, an assisted living home on the other side of town. When I arrived that afternoon, the receptionist smiled politely. "Visiting someone?" "Yes. Margaret Ellis. I believe she knew my father, Robert Mitchell." Her smile faltered slightly. "Oh, yes. Miss Margaret's still sharp as a tack. She'll be happy to see a visitor." I followed her down the hall. Soft beige walls, the faint scent of lavender and disinfectant. Margaret was sitting by a window, a light shawl over her shoulders. She must have been in her 70s, maybe older, but her eyes were bright, alert. When she looked up and saw me, her expression changed, not to surprise, but recognition. "You're Clara, aren't you?" The words stopped me cold. "How do you know my name?" She smiled faintly. "You look just like your mother. Robert showed me your picture once. Said he didn't deserve you." I sank into the chair opposite her. You knew about me. And Grace. She nodded slowly. Yes, I was. His sister. His sister. That revelation hit harder than I expected. My father's family had always been distant, names mentioned in passing, never faces. He'd kept them separate from us, claiming they were complicated people. Now I understood why. You helped him keep it all secret, I said softly. Margaret sighed. I helped him keep himself together, Clara. You may not want to hear this, but your father was not an evil man, just a weak one. I felt my jaw tighten. He abandoned my mother, lied to both families, and left us to pick up the pieces. She didn't flinch. I know, but he carried guilt until the day he died. He told me everything about you, about Grace, about the night he tried to tell your mother and couldn't. I leaned forward. Why couldn't he? Her eyes softened. Because she already knew. She found out years ago. My breath caught. What? Your mother found one of his letters. She came to me, furious, heartbroken, but she made me promise not to tell you. She didn't want you growing up thinking your father was a monster. She wanted you to believe he was just flawed. My vision blurred. The room felt suddenly smaller. So my mother, the woman I'd worshipped for her strength, her calm, had carried that secret too. She'd known, and she'd chosen silence. Why didn't she tell me? I whispered. Margaret reached across the table, her hand trembling but warm. Because she wanted you to have peace. She thought truth would only poison you. I stared at her hand. She was wrong. Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening. Maybe, but she was doing what mothers do, protecting their children from pain, even when it costs them everything. I drove home in silence. The sky was turning gray, a drizzle beginning to fall. My wipers kept time with my heartbeat. My mind replayed every argument I'd ever had with my father, every cold word, every unreturned call. He'd tried, in his clumsy way, to make amends before he died, and I'd believed I'd forgiven him. But now that forgiveness felt hollow. How do you forgive a man who lied to everyone he claimed to love? And yet, how do you hold anger towards someone who clearly couldn't live with his own choices? That night, I sat in front of the fire with the old photo album I'd once refused to open. There was my mother, smiling softly, one arm around me, the other hand resting on the edge of a chair, as if steadying herself against something unseen. And in that moment, I realized she hadn't been steady. She'd been enduring, the quiet kind of endurance only women like her could manage, the kind that doesn't shout or rage, but simply carries on because life won't wait for grief to finish. The next day, I called Grace. She answered after a few rings. Hey, she said cautiously. Hey, I found someone. My father's sister, Margaret. She knew about both of us. Grace was silent for a moment. What did she say? That he regretted it? That he was ashamed? Grace exhaled slowly. You believe her? I paused. I don't know, but I want to. She was quiet again before saying, You know, I keep thinking about how different our lives were, you growing up without him, me growing up with him. And somehow, we both ended up here, trying to forgive the same manual. Her words hung in the air between us. I think that's the cruel part, I said softly. He didn't just split his life, he split ours. Grace sniffled. Maybe we can fix that. For ourselves. For the first time, I smiled genuinely. I'd like that. The following weekend, Grace invited me to her home, a cozy little house with light blue shutters and a small garden out front. She introduced me to her husband, Daniel, and her daughter, a shy little girl named Ava, who stared up at me and said, You look like my mommy. I laughed, my throat tightening. I guess we're family then. We spent the afternoon sharing stories, some painful, some funny, and for the first time in years, I felt something resembling peace, because maybe forgiveness wasn't about pretending it didn't hurt. Maybe it was about choosing to stop letting the pain define who I was. Later that night, after I'd driven home, I stood in my father's old study, the one I'd cleaned out months ago. There was still one box left. I hadn't opened it. Inside were his journals. The first page began with a line that made my heart clench. If Clara ever finds this, tell her I did love her. I just didn't know how to show it. My knees went weak. I sat down, the book trembling in my hands. Page after page, he'd written about guilt, about fear, about trying to keep two worlds from colliding and destroying everyone. He'd failed, of course. But he'd known he was failing, and somehow, that made me feel both closer to him and farther than ever. By the time I closed the last journal, the fire had gone out, leaving only the soft glow of the lamp. I realized forgiveness wasn't something you gave once. It was something you kept choosing every time the memory returned. And that night, I chose it again, not for him, for me. The morning after I read my father's journals, I didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because the pain had finally settled somewhere deeper. It was quieter now, like the low hum of an old refrigerator, always there, but no longer startling. I made coffee, sat by the same kitchen window where I'd once cursed his name, and just breathed. For the first time, I wasn't angry at him. I wasn't angry at my mother. I wasn't even angry at Grace. I was just tired of carrying the weight of people who never learned how to love the right way. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery. It had been almost a year since I'd last visited his grave. The grass had grown wild around the headstone, and the engraved letters, Robert Mitchell, 1958 to 2023, were dusted with soil and fallen leaves. I knelt down, brushed them clean, and sat cross-legged like a child. I found your journals, I said softly. And Grace and Margaret. A breeze swept through the trees, lifting the edge of my scarf. I used to think you ruined everything, I continued. But now I think you were just human, scared, broken in ways I didn't understand. The silence around me was peaceful, not heavy. I don't hate you anymore, I whispered. But I can't pretend I forgive you completely either. I'm still learning how. I placed the letter Grace had given me, the one he'd written for her, beside the stone. Maybe you'll understand each other now, I said quietly. Then I smiled, through tears that came slower this time. Rest easy, Dad. I'll take it from here. In the weeks that followed, Grace and I spoke often. Sometimes about him, sometimes about life, work, motherhood, grief. It wasn't easy at first. Every conversation felt like walking barefoot on glass, cautious, deliberate, afraid to step wrong. But little by little, the pain turned into something else, connection. We discovered small similarities. The way we both stirred our tea counterclockwise, how we both hummed under our breath when nervous. Even the same half smile when trying not to cry. I realized that even if my father had split his life in two, he'd unknowingly left us fragments of himself, pieces that finally made sense when put together. One evening, Grace invited me back to her house for dinner. Her daughter, Ava, greeted me at the door with a drawing, a stick figure family holding hands. "This is you," she said, pointing at one of the figures. "Your Auntie Clara." Something inside me broke and healed at the same time. I knelt down and hugged her. "That's the best picture I've ever seen." Grace smiled from the kitchen doorway, her eyes warm. "She's been talking about you all week," she said. "Well," I replied, wiping my eyes. "I've been thinking about her too." We sat together after dinner. No tension, no awkward silences. Just two women rebuilding something they didn't even know they'd lost. Later that night, as I drove home, I thought about how strange forgiveness is. It's not a clean break. It's not some grand, cinematic moment where the music swells and everything is okay again. It's smaller than that. It's choosing to pick up the phone instead of ignoring the call. It's remembering someone's good days alongside their worst. It's looking at an old photograph and smiling instead of wincing. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't about erasing pain. It's about learning to live beside it, without letting it define the rest of your story. Months later, I decided to restore my father's old study, the one I'd once sworn I'd never set foot in again. I painted the walls a lighter color, replaced the heavy drapes with sheer white curtains, and filled the room with sunlight. On the desk, I placed one photograph, not of him, but of me, my mother, and Grace together the day we first met as sisters. It wasn't perfect. Our smiles were tentative, our arms unsure, but it was real. That room, once filled with lies and secrets, now held something else entirely: honesty. I realized then that maybe redemption doesn't always belong to the person who caused the pain. Sometimes it belongs to the ones who survive it, who choose to build something honest from the ruins. A few weeks later, Grace called me. "You know," she said, "Dad's birthday is coming up." I was thinking, maybe we should visit him together this year. I hesitated, but only for a moment. "Yeah," I said softly. "I think he'd like that." When the day came, we brought flowers, lilies for Grace, sunflowers for me. We stood side by side at his grave, the autumn wind brushing through the trees. For a while, we didn't say anything. Then Grace spoke. "I used to think love was supposed to be perfect," she said quietly. "But maybe love is just trying, even when you fail." I nodded. "Maybe that's all any of us can do." We placed the flowers together, our hands brushing. It wasn't forgiveness. Not fully, but it was something close enough to start again. As we walked back to the car, I looked up at the sky, pale gray clouds moving slowly across a soft blue horizon, and I thought of all the people who live their lives waiting for an apology that never comes. All the daughters who keep holding their breath for their fathers to finally see them. Maybe this story, my story, wasn't just about betrayal or loss. Maybe it was about release. Because sometimes, the person you need to forgive isn't the one who hurt you. Sometimes, it's the version of yourself that kept holding on. That night, I wrote the final entry in my own journal, something my father had started, and I was choosing to finish. "I forgive you, Dad. Not because you earned it, but because I deserve peace." I closed the book, placed it beside his old one, and turned off the light. The room went dark, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything that had once been lost. And for the first time, I felt free.